Hey, what's going on, guys? I know this is going to sound crazy, but I believe that Islam Makhachev will be fighting sooner than you probably think. And not only that, I believe Islam Makhachev's next lightweight title defense will be on a free UFC Fight Night card, a non-pay-per-view. And I know this sounds crazy, and I want to be very clear, this is pure speculation, but when you start to piece the puzzle together, when you start to follow the breadcrumbs, it makes perfect sense. And that is why I am very confident that this comes to fruition. And honestly, I've had this theory since UFC 294 where Islam Makhachev knocked out Alexander Volkanovski and basically took no damage. It ended in the first round. But recently we got a little bit more evidence that I think makes this claim a little bit more credible, but I'm going to break it all down in this video and you can come to your own conclusion. I'm even going to talk about who I believe Islam Makhachev's next opponent will be because that's still up in the air as well. But I want to start off with Islam Makhachev did an interview with Russian media where he said two very important things. One, he said, I want to fight 3 times in 2024. And secondly, he said he wants to fight before Ramadan. Well, when is Ramadan? Ramadan is March 10th to April 9th. So that means that Islam Makhachev has to fight before March 10th. Because if he doesn't fight before March 10th, he's not fighting till June or July because he needs time to recover from Ramadan. Well, if you start to break down the pay-per-view schedule for early 2024, you look at UFC 297. You have Sean Strickland defending his middleweight title versus Dricus du Plessis. Now, there were rumors. There was some reporting by Ariel Helwani that the UFC was kind of trying to make Islam Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira. Ultimately, that didn't come to fruition. It wouldn't shock me if the UFC were like 30% there and making Islam Makhachev versus Oliveira, and then as soon as Ariel Helwani broke the news, they decided to switch to Strickland versus du Plessis. But nonetheless, with that middleweight title fight on the card, they're not going to book Islam Makhachev versus somebody as the co-main event, or they're not going to main event that over Strickland versus du Plessis. It just makes no sense. So then you go to UFC 298, which is in February 17th, and that's going to be in California. You already have a main event for that as well. You have Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria for the featherweight title. Now, could you add Islam Makhachev to this card? Yes, but it would be problematic because first off, he would have to main event over Volkanovski, most likely, considering Makhachev would be considered the bigger draw. But it just doesn't make sense to have them both on the same card, no matter where the placement is. Because to promote Alexander Volkanovski and promote Islam Makhachev on the same card means you have Volkanovski, who's the champion. You're trying to defend him as, pound for pound, one of the best, which he is. But then right afterwards, you're going to show highlights of Islam Makhachev knocking him out. And on top of that, Alexander Volkanovski has already shown that he can be a headliner for pay-per-views for the UFC. He did it against Yair Rodriguez at UFC 290, International Fight Week. UFC 266, which was technically International Fight Week, even though it was in September, he headlined against Brian Ortega. So even if you take out of the fact that, well, it's going to be kind of weird to promote the fight because Islam Makhachev just knocked him out, then, you still start looking at it. It doesn't make sense. It's basically 2 headliners at the top of UFC 298. They're just not going to do that. So then you get to UFC 299, which barely makes the deadline. It happens on March 9th. And this has already had a main event that's been announced, and that is Sean O'Malley versus Marlon Chito Vera 2. Now, the UFC already looks at Sean O'Malley as a budding superstar. And this is kind of a grudge match that they're promoting here. That's why Vera is getting the title shot, even though he doesn't deserve it. Because Marlon Vera, back in, I believe it was 2020, brutally chopped the legs of Sean O'Malley, shucked him to the ground, flash KO'd him with brutal ground and pound elbows. And then O'Malley was stretchered out of the cage with no serious injuries. But O'Malley since then built himself back up. He won the bantamweight title. He stopped Aljamain Sterling earlier this year. And now they're booking him against Marlon Vera, and they're trying to really push O'Malley. They think 1, maybe 2 more fights, and O'Malley's this massive mega star in the UFC, a big pay-per-view draw. That's why they're booking this fight. They're not going to book Islam Makhachev to headline over Sean O'Malley. So then you get into UFC 300. There's been speculation, Islam Makhachev will fight on UFC 300. That's already a shoo-in. A lot of people have been saying that. UFC 300 doesn't have a date yet, but it's going to be early April. Or maybe late March, but most likely it'll be the first week of April. That doesn't line up with the timeline. Because even though Ramadan ends on April 9th, Islam Makhachev's not going to fight that soon afterwards. He can't do a training camp during Ramadan, so he's not fighting till June or July. So it doesn't make sense for Islam Makhachev to be placed on 297, 298, or 299. or 300. So you're looking at 301, maybe 302. I don't even think 301 would work. So it'd be 302 or 303, which would be around summertime, June, July, maybe International Fight Week. Well, if Islam Makhachev wants to fight 3 times this year, if he fights the first time in July or June, he's only going to fight one more time. He's not going to fight 2 times in the last 6 months of the year. It's just not going to happen. And Islam Makhachev, last year he wanted to fight 3 times. He asked for a fight in summer of 2023. He wasn't given it. He fought in February, then he fought in October in Abu Dhabi. So I'm thinking the UFC is more inclined, okay, Islam wants to stay active. We could build him into a pay-per-view draw. He's already doing well. Well, let's make him active. Let's let him be active. If he's staying healthy, he's not injured, let's have him be active and defend the lightweight title in one of the best divisions in the UFC. Well, in that case, where are you going to put him? Because all 3 of the early pay-per-views are already booked. Now, you could shift around the pay-per-views and, maybe UFC 300 would be a little bit later. I don't know how exactly you would do it, but you would basically have to do an extra pay-per-view. You would have to shift O'Malley versus Vera back to late March on UFC 300 maybe, and then make UFC 299 Makhachev versus whoever, but that doesn't really make sense. I don't think that's going to happen. So where else can he fight if he's not fighting on those pay-per-views? I've had this theory since the second it was announced. The UFC is going to Saudi Arabia on March 2nd. It's supposed to be a UFC Fight Night card. Well, guess what? Islam Makhachev would be the perfect headliner for Saudi Arabia. When the UFC goes over to the Middle East, they like to have a Muslim champion headline the card. Islam Makhachev headlining the last 2 years in Abu Dhabi. For a couple years, we had Khabib Nurmagomedov headlining the cards in Abu Dhabi. And it just makes perfect sense. If Makhachev wants to fight before Ramadan, March 2nd, clearly before Ramadan, and Saudi Arabia, the first UFC fight in Saudi Arabia, where they just signed a massive deal. The government is paying them. If you don't know, let me take you back. Because if you go and look at the Abu Dhabi cards, whether it be UFC 280 or UFC 294, which was just recently, and many cards in the past as well, that they've done in the afternoon. The UFC, when they do a pay-per-view in the afternoon, they lose potential pay-per-view buys. Basically, no matter how good the card is, you're not going to get anywhere near what you usually would get in terms of pay-per-view buys because people are busy on Saturday afternoon. Saturday night, people are more inclined to buy pay-per-views. And it used to be the UFC would do a weird time in Abu Dhabi, or even at one point they were doing a tape delay. I want to say it was like for an Anderson Silva, Damian Maia fight. I could be wrong on that. But they used to do a tape delay so they could have it in prime time in Abu Dhabi, but also prime time in the United States because they wanted to get those pay-per-view buys, but that didn't really work out for them. So what happens is, the reason the UFC takes these mega cards to Abu Dhabi, UFC 294, crazy stacked, UFC 280, crazy stacked, the last 2 years in Abu Dhabi, is because they have a deal with the Abu Dhabi government. The Abu Dhabi government pays them millions of dollars to come there and hold an event, and that supplements the pay-per-view revenue that they're losing. Now, I don't know how the UFC works that out with ESPN, because ESPN technically collects the pay-per-view money. My guess is the UFC gets a cut from Abu Dhabi, then they cut ESPN a check. I don't know exactly all the intricate details of how the financials are transferred. But the UFC loses out on pay-per-view buys for these massive events because the government pays them. Well, guess what? Saudi Arabia has an unbelievable amount of money. When they have these different events and they call it the Riyadh season, they just had Francis Ngannou versus Tyson Fury. They paid Francis Ngannou over $10 million. Plus they gave him like a watch that was worth $200,000. And then they had Tyson Fury, I believe he got paid $40 or $50 million. That event isn't drawing that much pay-per-view revenue. They didn't care because they have so much money. The Public Investment Fund has $776 billion. That is the Saudi Arabia Public Investment Fund that they use to pay for all these events for Riyadh season and whatnot. They literally make a guy like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos look poor. That's how much money they have. So guess what? If they pay the UFC is going to bring an amazing fight night card to Saudi Arabia. It doesn't matter that typically this guy would be on a pay-per-view card, because guess what? They're going to make the same amount of money because Saudi Arabia is going to be willing to pay them millions upon millions of dollars. So I believe on March 2nd in Abu Dhabi, we're going to get a UFC Fight Night card headlined by Islam Makhachev, which is just crazy when you think about it, but it's Saudi Arabia money. I've talked about this in recent videos where we're talking about Francis Ngannou and how much money did he make compared to pay-per-view buys. Saudi Arabia, For the Francis Ngannou-Tyson Fury fight, they didn't care about pay-per-view buys. They just care about getting the best possible event. You think the UFC is going to take a Brendan Allen versus Paul Craig type fight night card and take it to Saudi Arabia? And on top of all this, when the UFC goes to a new place, guess what? They like to do a big card. They literally, every time they go to a place for the first time, or 99% of the time, they bring a banger card. For example, UFC 205, that was Conor McGregor versus Eddie Alvarez for the lightweight title. Crazy stacked card, first card at MSG. And even if, here's another example, it's not the same thing as going to a place for the first time. When the UFC signed the Fox deal, for those of you who don't know, before ESPN, the UFC signed a deal with Fox. That was kind of like their first really massive mainstream deal. It was with Fox. They had events on Fox Sports 1. They had events on Fox, regular Fox, and they had events on like Fuel TV and Versus and FX for a while. And when the UFC signed that deal, the first event they had on free TV on Fox was Cain Velasquez versus Junior Dos Santos for the heavyweight title. Now, just to put that in perspective, that would essentially be close to John Jones versus Tom Aspinall being on free TV right now for the heavyweight belt. Maybe, John Jones Aspinall is probably a bit bigger just because of John Jones' star power, but Cain Velasquez versus Junior Dos Santos 1 for the heavyweight title was a massive pay-per-view worthy fight, and they put it on free TV because guess what? They just signed the Fox deal. They wanted to bring in a bunch of viewers. They wanted to start off with a bang. And the same situation is going to happen with Saudi Arabia. They're not going to take a crappy Apex card there. They're not going to have Mackenzie Dern versus Angela Hill main event in Saudi Arabia. No, they're going to want to bring their best possible card, regardless of who it is, because the Saudi Arabia government is going to pay them tens of millions of dollars to bring the best possible card there. And that's why I believe that on March 2nd in Saudi Arabia, we will get Islam Makhachev defending his lightweight title. Now that begs the question, who will he fight? Because really there's a couple options. It could be Islam Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira. This is the fight that was originally supposed to happen at UFC 280. Charles Oliveira gets cut the day before he's supposed to fly out to Abu Dhabi. He pulls out, Volkanovski steps in, and we all know what happened from there. So that is the fight that could happen. But to be honest, and I'm the biggest Charles Oliveira fan there is, it's not like Charles Oliveira has a concrete claim to the next title shot. He lost to Islam Makhachev at UFC 280, basically got dominated. I think that's a bit exaggeratory, but you get my point. He lost the majority of the fight and he got finished. And then he went out there and finished Beneil Dariush, which is a solid win. But nonetheless, it's not like he's on this crazy win streak, undeniable for a title shot. It's not like he even never fought Islam before. He's fought him before recently. So it may not be Charles Oliveira. The UFC may not book him against Charles Oliveira. Now, maybe they will. I think that's probably, I don't even know. I want to put a percentage on it, but it's very, very possible. But that's not what I believe is going to happen. I'm going to get to what I believe will happen in a minute. Well, what else could they book? Well, the next possible option would be Islam Makhachev versus Justin Gaethje. Justin Gaethje on a little bit of a win streak, just won the BMF title, knocked out Dustin Poirier, and also is managed by Ali Abdelaziz, who manages Islam Makhachev as well. So that's a big, kind of factor in this whole situation. Of course, Ali Abdelaziz wants to double dip. He's going to want to have the challenger be managed by him and the champion be managed by him. Well, who's another option? There's one more option that I think is plausible but unlikely. UFC 296 is a couple weeks away. The main event is Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington. There is a chance Leon Edwards and Colby Covington have both shown interest in not fighting welterweight contenders. I hate the welterweight division, by the way, but they've shown interest. Colby Covington specifically mentioned Islam Makhachev. Leon Edwards specifically mentioned maybe going to a different weight class. So it is possible. I think it's most likely if it's Colby Covington. If Colby Covington beats Leon Edwards, I think there's a chance you could see Islam Makhachev versus Colby Covington on a fight night card in Saudi Arabia. Now, they could change it and maybe not number it and still charge for it. I don't know how that would work, or again, they could shuffle around the card. But right now, looking at the schedule, looking at the layout, it's probably going to be March 2nd in Saudi Arabia, no matter who Islam Makhachev fights. Now, who do I personally believe will end up getting the title shot? I have jumped around multiple times, and I really think the two most likely prospects are Charles Oliveira or Justin Gaethje. But if I had to nail down a prediction in this video, I'm going to say March 2nd in Saudi Arabia on a UFC Fight Night card, you were getting Islam Makhachev defending his lightweight title against Justin Gaethje. I just think the momentum that Justin Gaethje is already on, winning the BMF title, knocking out Dustin Poirier. Then on top of that, he's managed by Ali Abdelaziz, who's the same manager as Islam Makhachev. Then on top of that, I know there's some conspiracy theories that Charles Oliveira didn't want to go to Abu Dhabi and that's why he got cut. I do think it was weird that he's hard sparring the day before he's supposed to leave without headgear. But forget about that. It's very well known that Charles Oliveira didn't want to go to Abu Dhabi. You think he's going to want to go to Saudi Arabia? I don't think so. So he could say, oh, I'll wait out for my title shot. And the UFC said, okay, we'll move on to Justin Gaethje. Islam Makhachev versus Justin Gaethje is a massive fight. So for my prediction, I think it's going to be Islam Makhachev versus Justin Gaethje in Saudi Arabia, March 2nd. And most likely a free UFC Fight Night card because Saudi Arabia has so much money they do not care. They could buy the UFC 50 times over and just own the UFC if they wanted to. That's how much money they have. And they're going to supplement the UFC's pay-per-view losses by holding such a big event as a Fight Night card, but it's still going to be a mega event for them, and that's all they truly care about. And I wanted to make a video about this because I called this a couple weeks ago. I said, listen, this is my theory. This is why I think it's going to happen. But if you really start to put all those things together, the way the UFC likes to go to a location and really put on a great, spectacular event, the fact that they're willing to put on big title fights, when they signed the Fox deal, and the fact that we've seen, when they go to Abu Dhabi, obviously they still charge for that pay-per-view, but they lose a lot of pay-per-view sales because of the time that they're holding the event in the United States or North America in general. So they're going to be willing to lose some money, or they're not even going to lose any money, but they're going to be willing to lose some pay-per-view buys because Saudi Arabia is going to supplement that with tens of millions of dollars. That's why I believe Islam Makhachev's next lightweight title defense will be in Saudi Arabia on March 2nd. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. I'm truly curious. Do you think this is going to come to fruition? Because I truly believe this will happen. Let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Please subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for watching.